Well, thank you very much for being invited to come here and the opportunity to talk. I don't do as much talking as May in terms of the number of talks, and at the end, as May did, I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, so I'll see if we can master this creature first. So I'm going to cover things that touch on early literacy development. And effectively in the education sphere, which is where I am, or part of me is, that really looks at children who gain the skills that will allow them to become competent readers. Okay? So it's up to probably end of primary 2, around that stage. Now the good thing about children, and we've seen children this morning and that's good, is that they are designed to learn. I think a lot of us forget that children who struggle with early learning and have difficulties, somehow they're different. But really, children come along as a very, not an empty space, but a space that is very receptive to learning. And we heard May talk about some of those things. So they're ready to learn. There are critical times or better times to do things, but May emphasised that whatever stage of life a child's at, they have the capacity to learn from then on. So that's the important thing. So our job as parents and educators is to take advantage of that time to ensure that they develop the early skills they need, and we're talking about literacy, so then they can go through their lives using that skill. So the thing about early learning is that if you think of a young child and how complex language is, very, very complex, and yet nearly all young children develop language normally. And if you expose a young child to a number of languages, they develop those as well, so they can learn 2 or 3 languages at the one time. So they are ready, so that's good. Okay. Hang on, did I do that one? Okay, so I'll just touch it. Now, I may not cover all of these, but the slides have got other information. Okay. So some of the things we're going to talk about is being sensitive to what is normal with young learners and how you can help your child, understanding what's typical. And the word typical, from my psychological perspective and teacher perspective, really means what's normal. What do we typically see? And one of the things I'll point out is that typical isn't a narrow line. Typical is a very broad area to work in. My PhD, which I'll touch on a couple of times, was looking how parents on the one hand and teachers on the other perceived how their child were learning and developing, particularly in literacy. So how did they think they were developing at the same time? How did parents think about that? And how did teachers view the same child about the same issues? And we'll touch on a couple of things that might predict or areas that might become a concern to a parent. Now, people talk about literacy and reading as a very discrete thing. They sit down with a book and they read, but it's not like that at all. Firstly, it's a long road. It starts when they're born, and it hopefully finishes around primary 2, where they've got those early literacy skills. But it's not reading words. It's a lot of things before then and during that time. So it involves a whole lot of things. Obviously, language. A child has to be competent with their receptive language, and then in time their expressive language. They have to have a degree. Cognitive ability is code for intelligence. Now, as I said before, there's a wide range of things, but most people have sufficient intelligence, and when I say most, I'm probably thinking 95% of the population have sufficient intelligence to learn to read effectively. Okay, they need to have the right visual skills, obviously, the right attitude. And May's been talking about motivation and challenging things, and that's part of that. The right personality. And they're things they get from their parents and things they learn along the way. And one of the things that's very important is exposed to models of reading behaviour. And a little later on I'll touch on that more, but essentially a lot of the practice and intense intervention that some parents choose to do or have to do because of therapy and the like lacks that model of reading. They don't see mum read, they don't see dad read. They just know that they're being made to read. So it's got to be a natural thing. They've got to see reading as what people do. Okay, so parent expectations. Okay, so the exciting thing, or the good thing, is that most parents have an expectation their children will learn to read, and it's one of the primary things. If you ask parents of young children, you know, what do you expect your child to gain from schooling, they'll mention reading. Okay, and the good thing is, of course, that I've already said, and you would know from your experience, that most people do learn to read quite easily. Okay. But this difference of what typical or normal is very, very broad. And I've got an example here out of my research. So the end point is they're born, they begin to expose to language and everything else, and somewhere around 7, 8 years old, they've got all the basics they need to become competent readers, and they can apply those skills. But how they go from there to there can be very, very different. And I suppose as parents and educators, we might know what the goal is, and we can be told they'll get there, but it is a concern if that progress doesn't look reassuring to us. Okay, but just to illustrate at one extreme, we have a group of children called precocious readers. Now these are children who teach themselves to read. Now you've probably got friends and who are, I won't say boasting, but you know, little Mary, little Hannah, you know, only X years old, reads wonderfully. We did all the right thing as parents, and look, she's only 4 and she can read. Okay, the reality is that there's a small group of children who have an innate attraction to words and how to read, and they do teach themselves to read. Now often they're from parents, their parents are very interested in reading and development, their parents do provide lots of stimulation, but they've actually taught themselves to read. They're very unusual children, and they do get to the end of early literacy much sooner, obviously, than others. And in my research, my research was about, I got 30 volunteer families from all sorts of walks of life, different cultural backgrounds, different schooling experience of the parents, and I observed their behaviour or their development over a period of 3 years in excruciating detail, believe me. My supervised setup, there was enough there for like 3 PhDs. There was just so much detail. When you do longitudinal studies with any subject, you've got to make sure that you ask everything at the start, because you can't go back and say, oh, I wish I had have covered this 2 years ago, because that looks like it's going to be really interesting. So I did it all, and we had lots of research, lots of results, let's say. But what this represents here is, and I measured lots of things, development, intelligence, language, perception, all sorts, but this is just basic reading of words. And it's based on a formal test, a standardised test, that was suitable for children from 4 years old through to adults. So it picked up whatever these young children. So I'll just explain. I showed this to May last night, and she was a bit confused. She's very clever, of course, and I thought if she's confused, I better explain it. So essentially what that's saying is these are all the children, and here number 1 is the start of when I did my observations, and it goes right up to number 9 up here. So half the group I looked at for 2 years. So number 3 is the end of what we used to call preschool, so around year 5 years old, and number 6 here is the end of year 1. So that's after 2 years of exposure to formal school. So the thing I want you to note there is, just by, in other words, chance, one child came along and they were a precocious reader. I didn't know. I remember meeting the mum the year before they started the project, which started in January of our school year. I met them back in November, And the mum said to me, and this little guy's like yay big, she said, "Oh, he can read." And I said, "Oh, yes, of course he can read." You know. Well, what do you know? So when I first assessed him, he started here. He's higher, I think, than all but one child 2 years later. Okay, so he was a precocious reader, and that obviously became apparent very early in the piece because I was doing lots of assessment. But the other thing to note is that this is at the start of preschool. Now, these aren't word reading skills. These are recognising letters, matching letters, all sorts of things. And then later in the piece, they involve reading words. But you can see there's lots of wiggles and ups and downs, but somewhere around early year 1, so 5.5-ish, things start to happen in the number of words children can read. Okay? So at this stage, you can see that most of these kids are going to be fine, but you can also see one little fella here who was, you know, looking like he may have quite a significant problem. And in my group, and I wasn't going to say this today because I hadn't thought about this, there were probably certainly one very at-risk learner and a couple of others that were really, you know, going to take a long time to get there. But certainly those 13 in the middle and the high one were well on the way. Okay, but they're all normal. Well, this group here are all normal. But if you went to see them, even some here, they got almost no skills. You think, oh my goodness. So you do have to be a bit patient and be observant about what's going on. Okay. And this little boy, I'm illustrating this as an exception because I think, and don't judge me too harshly, I work in Hong Kong, all sorts of Asian cultures, but you know, you rightly pride or very proud of excellence and high achievement, and that's very important. But that is a very small number of people. You know, by definition, it has to be. So most people are average, so very few people are going to excel. But it is important that whatever your ability is, you excel within that ability. So this is what this little, this little boy, I call him Sam, that's my son's name, it wasn't my son. He's at the other end like me, reading problems. Okay, so this child wrote this story without any help at all. He got on a computer and he typed that story without any help. Not help with spelling or anything. So you look at this and you think, wow, that's incredible. But at the same time, this is what he could write with his handwriting. So he's only 4.5, 5 at this stage. So that's a very exceptional learner. Okay? But I'm going to tell you a story related to this boy just in terms of perception. So this little boy was like this. When he was in, this is preschool, when he was in year 1, his teacher came to me. So I had been working with him for 18 months. So I'd assessed him 5 or 6 times by then. I knew him inside out in terms of him as a learner. I'd looked at all his activities at home and all sorts of things, but the teacher said to me that he wasn't managing. And I was shocked. Like he was out there, and I thought, what's going on? How can and a very good teacher, she was very switched on to young readers and things, and she had seen his good performance as well. And I talked to him and I said to him, yeah, Sam, your teacher tells me you're struggling, and this was to do with spelling. And I said, why are you getting your spelling words wrong? Because he could spell like this in preschool without any help. And he told me, and this is where children come from, he said, well, when the teacher asks how people have done with their spelling, you put your hand up if you've got more right than last week. So if you got 5 more right, you know, whatever. So everyone got to put their hand up, but he didn't get to put his hand up because he always got them all right. So he worked that out. So what's going on? He said, well, I decided, this is him, I decided I'd get some wrong so that then next week I could get more right. So he was a clever guy. Okay. So when we're looking at perception and literacy and things, you know, do parents worry? Well, I don't have to ask you. We do worry. We worry from the moment we hear we're going to be parents, and my children are 26 or 5 and 24 or something, and we worry. You know, it's part of our job, and that's part of the way we, you know, engage and sort of keep an eye on things. And when they're little, we worry about, you know, fingers and toes and all the rest of it. Are they hungry? Are they sick? Are they tired? And that's part of it. Okay, but then as they grow and they begin to, we're thinking about kindy, preschool, you know, we think about all the things we've done about that. We start to wonder about how they'll manage their learning. Okay, and it's that period that I think we've got to think clearly about what we're doing. Not when they're at the end of primary 1 and they're struggling. It's back then. And the things that I'll highlight here are things like routine, you know, their self-esteem, their ability to engage in learning, the routines at home about all sorts of things which will then be able to be used for routine, for practice and things. Okay. This is something that's come out of my research, and as I said last night I talked to May about it and she was a bit confused as a very clever person, so I just put it in because it's an interesting thing that came out of the research, but it is also relevant for parents, especially if they're concerned about their children. So there's mum there, and it's often mums who worry. You know, that's the reality, although more and more dads, certainly in my practice and I think here, becoming, you know, genuinely and fully involved with their children and their education. So essentially, and I won't dwell on this, but I will explain it a bit more because, as I said last night, there was some confusion. If you look at, see my little slight shake there is working well. If you ask a parent, how's your child going today? They'll rate them. If you ask them in 2 months' time, they'll rate them. Now, I was asking 30 parents, forget how many questions, probably 40 questions about all sorts of things to do with, you know, their child's achievements. And then I was measuring that achievement, and that's what the PhD was about. So if you ask parents, they just judge on the day. So if they're concerned about little Billy and Billy has problems, their concerns will remain. Okay, so the concerns sort of woggle along. But at the same time, if you ask those children's teachers, their perceptions are quite different. Okay? In general, a teacher will have lower expectations of new children in their class than they do from the start of the year, which is this point here, than they do at the end of the year. You think, well, that doesn't quite make sense. So the parents are judging the children day to day, but the teachers' perceptions are different. Now, the relevance of this is that as a parent, if we're talking about a child who may have a problem or does have a problem. So the parent expresses their concern at the start of the year to the teacher. A bit like the mum saying this child could read, but it was the other way around. So you go along and say, look, I'm really worried. They don't seem to be, and it's fine. You know, we're starting primary 1, primary 2. I'm here, and I'm a primary school teacher, so I can say a little bit of this. And your job, you know, you embrace this group of children at the start of the year. You know you're going to work with them, and they're going to learn and develop. And then through the year, you'll have higher expectations of them. Okay? So at the start of the year, there's the likelihood that you'll have trouble convincing the child, the teacher, your child's got a difficulty. Okay, so that doesn't mean you ignore it. I'll say later, you must, you know, ensure that you try to get that, or you do get that message across. Okay, but as the year progresses for the teachers, their expectations of their class and individual children rises. So by the end of the year, that same teacher with the child with the problem will have a concern. Their expectations have moved up as the year progresses. They will see a child who's not progressing as being a worry. So that's that stage that they're more likely to go to the parent and say, you know, little Billy's not managing this year. And she said, well, I told you in, you know, term 1, hopefully it doesn't go that way, but that's an issue. And maybe you join together there and say, well, what can we do? Okay, so that's, you know, not ideal, but that's fine. But what happens, the year finishes, new teacher, new classroom, you go to the new teacher, and you say, oh, look, at the end of the last year I talked to Miss Smith or Miss Lou about, and they say, oh no, it's fine, you know, I'm here, you know, I'll sort it out. So there is a little, that pattern happens, okay? So if you've got a concern about your individual child, you need to know that at different times of the year, there's, it's a likelihood the teacher will have a different rating of the child. So at the start, they won't acknowledge a problem as much, and by the end of the year, they will acknowledge the problem, but of course then there's a new teacher and a new year. So it was an unusual observation that came out of it. Okay, this is something that's come out of I spend most of my time, my professional time, assessing people. And quite a deal of, probably 60 to 70% of those people are children from about 3 years old up to 8 or 9. I also see adults and do all sorts of things, but a lot of them are young children. And one of the things that's become evident to me is when children have difficulty with reading or spelling and things, in Australia and certainly in Singapore, there's a great focus on that child's difficulties and great effort and time and money put into helping them. But there's a risk, and this has happened over and over to children I work with, somewhere along the line with all that effort, the notion of why you're doing this stuff goes missing. And I touched on it before. They don't realise the link between what you're doing and what the therapist is doing, what the tutor's doing, what the and actual reading. Okay, so you've got to make sure through your, not by telling them, oh, reading's important because you'll be able to be the CEO of a company, but reading's important because it's something we all do. It's something that's enjoyable. Now, they might not enjoy it at the time, but it's important that they see it as a normal activity and they see you doing it. Okay, don't talk about how reading's so important, but they never see you with a book or reading something on a screen. So make sure you get that message by illustrating it. Okay, so you've got to show them as well as talk. So what's the to-do list? Okay, now being older, technology and children with iPads, I'm getting used to it. My kids are all teched up, of course, and they're on the internet and all the rest of it. But they've got to engage with books and with and without technology. Now, someone asked before, we were talking about computers. Someone mentioned about time on computers. Is that right? You said something to take the computer away. The TV, sorry, yes. Well, kids are great, they're very powerful little beings, but I've had parents, and I work in homes with parents with difficulties with behaviour and literacy. Well, let's say it's the computer. I turn it off. I tell him to stop and he won't stop. And then he throws a tantrum and he goes back to it. I say, well, just 5 more minutes, and then he won't stop. And his dad comes home, I say, well, have you ever tried turning it off? Well, I have, but he turns it on again. And I'm thinking, who's running this house? And I said, well, just take the cord away. You're in charge. If you tell him to stop, he stops. And some parents find that very tricky. But I went to one household, and this was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and we were talking about technology, and I asked about, was it a problem, and about the amount of time, and the mother said, not anymore. And I said, oh, well, what did you do? And she said, it's in the safe. I said, they literally, not as a punishment, but as a way of management, they got all the iPads and the technology, and they had a safe. They put it in the safe and they locked the door, and that was it. And it worked a treat, because everyone knew that that was the time without technology. Now that was extreme, but if necessary, I'd be doing it. Okay? Now the secret is engaging your child. Now that doesn't mean you do things to them. It means you do things with them. Okay? And it doesn't mean just books. It's language. And you saw some of May's wonderful pictures where a lot of the pictures of her own children, of Hannah and Callum, sitting, playing, talking, sometimes arguing. Okay, so it's lots of things to do with objects, images, books, words, and people. You've got to mix the people up. You might, single parents You know, they'll have visitors, you know, siblings, you know, mum and dad, if, you know, there's two parents, grandparents, okay? So you've got to mix those experiences around. Don't just fall back on, okay, we've got to do spelling, and I'm not being critical, believe me, but, you know, everything comes about spelling, but it's all those things that go to come together. The other thing is that the notion of routine, so that's what you do day to day, you know, through the day, through the week. One of the things I looked at in my research was routines, and something interesting came out of that, so I'm just going to touch on that. So this is just about sharing activities, just in terms of a bit about engagement. So we've got ourselves whoops, I'm not good at this, got ourselves a dad there reading. This is something that happened in my research. So one of the things I did with my 30 children is that not only did I collect a huge amount of data about stuff at home, books, everything else, but I also videoed them reading as well as testing them. And while I was talking to the mum of this boy, he started reading to his little sister. And he was quite a competent reader by this stage. I think he was in the end of year 2. And you can see what's happening there. She's very engaged because she's looking down at the book. He's very engaged and he's pointing. So this is, you know, two children working with each other. So it's very important to use those other people around in a positive way, you know, to engage your children. Whoops, have I missed something there? Oh, the to-do list. Okay. The other, in my research and in my work, I visit lots of homes. And I visit homes where very limited resources. They could be in what we call a caravan. Is that a thing, you know? Caravan, you know, house on wheels, you know, to palatial mansions, high-rise buildings in Hong Kong, all sorts of places. And when I work with children, and by work I mean generally I'm assessing them, that I usually ask, and I've got to be, you know, there's lots of rules about psychologists and special male psychologists and children, but I usually ask if I can see their bedroom. I don't ever go into the bedroom, but I look in the door, so to speak. And something struck me through, you know, 20 years of doing this is there seem to be two versions of bedrooms. And I'm not limiting it to bedrooms, but I think that's where you get the message very quickly. One is the word desert, and that's the one I don't like, is that you go into a bedroom, and I mean, I've seen children who've got literally thousands of dollars worth of toys. It's just ridiculous. They've got every robot and things. But if you look in that room, whether it's robots or dolls or whatever, it's a word desert. There is not a word in there. And I'm not talking about word lists that you're sort of trying to get them to read. I'm just talking about words, labels on things, you know, pictures, books. It's just nothing. It's just stuff. Okay? The opposite is a word jungle, where you look in there and it's just wonderful. It's got, you know, I don't care how untidy or tidy it is, but there's words that are attached to things and are available to them, and, you know, maybe calendars and pictures with names on them and all sorts of things. And in terms of my work and assessing people and why would I want to look into their bedroom anyway, I'll give you a very wonderful example that happened a few years ago. I was working with a child in a fairly affluent home. I think the dad worked in the media. I'm not saying that to avoid his name, I just don't know, but it's something to do with film or TV or something. And this little girl had lots of problems. And I did an assessment, and part of the assessment she said something like, and she was quite a delightful, animated sort of child. She said, "Oh, my daddy built a castle in my bedroom." And I thought, okay, so I just went on, and at the end of the assessment, and my assessments go to 3 to 4 hours, so, you know, it's a long time, but, you know, we're having breaks and games and stuff. And I said to the mum, look, she said something unusual to me, and I just wanted to check it out with you. She said, you know, that Dad had built a castle in her bedroom. And Mum said, oh yeah. And I said, could I see this? I couldn't quite imagine, you know, what it was. So we went to, with her permission, the little girl, we opened the door, and he'd actually built a castle. Her bed was part of this structure, and it looked like like a fairy tale sort of castle. There were turrets and windows and balconies, and the bed was sort of built in between, and it was just amazing. And on every little shelf and balcony there was a princess or a prince and a dragon, and it was all there. And she knew all the names of all the characters and what they did, and not a word to be seen. I mean, it was wonderful, but not a word to be seen. And the mum was very proud of it, and it was just a wonderful thing. But I said to the mum, look, this is her literacy. This is her literacy program. You've got it right here. I said, she's going to write stories about these characters, which she could tell me all about them, their names and what they did and the adventures they had. But as I said, no words. So what we did, we used that amazing, stimulating environment that the child was very engaged with, and with her dad and the characters, for her to write the storybooks with help, and that became the basis of her remedial program. And it was successful too. But it is important to look at the notion of engagement, what's going on. I suppose the difference I'd make, you might think, well, gosh, we've got stuff all over the house. The fridge is covered in, this week's word list. I'm not, that can be useful, but it's got to be linked to meaningful things, not just, facts, I suppose, or just basic things. Now, I mentioned a little while ago, I'm just looking at the time, about routines. Now, one of the things I measured in my PhD was how often did people do lots of stuff at home. And one of them was how often did they engage in literacy at home with books. Okay? Now, when you look across, when you look across those, so down the bottom, this is 3 years, right? But generally speaking, once a household, this is the groups of people, but once a household had a routine so this is, a child's 4 years old, and typically 6 times a week, the child and the parent would sit down with a book and an activity and do something. It might have been 10 times a week, it might have been 3 times a week, but typically the message is that number of times, the amount of time, is quite stable through that child's early life. And that's all right, but something happens, of course, is that when they get to school, and this point here is when they finish what we call preschool, when they get to school, so then I asked them, okay, so that's all happening with the child and mum and dad and that, but when they get to school, there's another factor. The teacher gets involved. So I asked them, how many times do you do literacy things that are requested by the teacher? And as you'd expect, those number of times increase from virtually nothing in preschool through to quite a few times. And that's what you'd expect. But the total number of times, so the number goes from almost none to 4 or 5 a week, but the total number of times stays the same. So effectively what happens is that people hand over their literacy activities at home to the teacher. Okay? And I think you've got to be aware of that, because firstly, parents usually, hopefully, enjoy that interaction with the kids. So having this precious time, it's very special. They're doing all sorts of things with words and books. They start school and the teachers, I won't say demands, but the teacher's role changes that process. And you're unaware of it because you're still doing 7 times a week, but 5 of those are because of what the teacher requested. So children with problems and literacy problems need lots of stimulation and more of that early gentle interaction of listening to stories and role-playing past the time that, when they enter school. So for lots of kids, they move on and become readers and enjoy reading, so it's all happening. But for the kids with problems, they haven't got to that stage, so you've got to keep that stimulation going. Okay, just a little bit on this, and May talked about this sort of the idea of persistence and engagement and resilience. That's a photo of a plant that's growing in Edinburgh in Scotland. Okay, and I was walking along the footpath, wasn't that long ago, a few weeks ago, and this, it's fairly grotty there, lovely city, but grotty, and you can see cigarette butts and things. And I just looked down. I was with my wife, and I thought, I've got to take a photo of that. How resilient, how persistent has this little plant been to live in that awful little spot there? Okay, so, and May talked about this in a sense that you've really got to encourage children to do things not on their own, but I suppose initiated by themselves, be able to entertain themselves in a meaningful way. Even that, and play is a meaningful thing, of course, a very important thing. So can they find activities to do and start them? Oh, Mummy, I don't know what to do. Okay? And I think there's a danger, especially with young parents who've got lots of energy, that they forever, as soon as the kid's not active, they're providing them with the next thing to do. And I suggest in Asia, in Singapore, Hong Kong, as May commented on, the notion is, we go from school to tutoring to gym to reading to drawing lessons, and they go home exhausted, and then it all starts again. There has to be a place where a child can be at home in a happy, safe environment, think of a task they want to do or a game they want to complete, go and get it, sit down and do it and finish it without lots of stimulation from outside. So that ability to self-soothe when they're distressed, the ability to entertain themselves and work independently is something we've got to value. So what you do then when you see that happening, you say, oh, that was lovely the way you play with your farm animals, and what did you make there, and engage in a conversation. And also I noticed when you finished, you showed your little sister, and then you packed it all up and put it away. That's fantastic. And commenting and observing the positive things that kids do is much more useful than commenting on the negative, because they pay attention, they want attention. So if they get attention for positive things, that's the thing they'll more likely repeat. Okay? But of course there's another sort of engagement, that's be engaged with other people. So the way I sort of, how do you know you're engaging a child, or are you just doing stuff with them? So if you both come to the activity willingly, that's a good sign. If you interact and participate in a positive way, okay, and it's a productive way, if all those things are happening, they're probably engaged with the activity, and you're engaged with it. And from my research, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of hours of videos, which I went through in great detail. The top two pictures are interesting because May mentioned about temperament. This little girl at the top, I wouldn't tell you her name anyway, let's call her Mary. When I first met her, she was 4, so she was part of the research study. Mum was a very conservative lady, very intelligent, tall lady, and she had this amazing dress on that went right to the ground. Big skirt, quite conservatively dressed, and she wanted her child to be part of the study. So she's talking about the little girls, let's say Mary, and I couldn't see Mary. Mary was around, and Mary was actually, it was like Nemo and the anemones. Mary was hiding in the flow of the skirt. Anyway, over the time I knew her, which was in her case 3 years, Mary became more and more, she was a lovely child, more and more outgoing, but I didn't, looked at temperament as part of the research. And the mum said, surprisingly, because she was quite an outgoing lady then, she said as a child she was exceedingly shy, and little Mary was just the same. Like, she didn't even want to appear. This was just in broad daylight. She was just chatting on the veranda of a school. But as you can see there, whoops, I'm not good at this, am I? That even at that early stage, and this is one of the things, when you're helping a child to read, you don't go over and say, we're going to read this book. You give them choices. So there's 3 or 4 books there. Each time I saw the child, they brought books from home, as well as the formal tests, and they could sort through them and decide which book they wanted to use. And there they are. That was a couple of years later, where she's sitting there with Mum on her lap, and looking happy and focusing down and pointing and doing the activity. So that's an engaged child. She's engaged, but as I'm trying to say is with routine with all sorts of things. You don't start there when you pick the books up. You know, all these activities, even reading, has to come before that. Picking the books out, choosing a book from the group, that's all part of the process before you get to this nice engagement. You can't just produce the book and expect it all to happen. You've got to prepare yourself, you've got to prepare the child. It's a bit like bedtime routines. You know, it's 8:30, gosh, it's a school day, this kid should be in bed. If you're thinking about that, then you've missed the boat by about 4 hours, okay, or even longer. You've got to go back early afternoon and think what's happening. Then, you know, things will work much better. So she's engaged, and one of the little boys here, oh, I'm sorry about this. I just don't, one of the little boys wasn't very engaged, as you can see. His mum was a teacher and you know, a very capable person, but this little guy was, you know, not part of the scene. And as you can see, he's sort of looking around there, you know, fiddling, and then on the same session here he is sort of twisting and turning right away, and mum's doing the reading. Anyway, he did do very well. He was quite clever, but he was very hard to engage in things. Okay, so we just briefly touch on resilience. Okay, so resilience is sort of the ability to cope with adversity, as May was saying, about challenges. It's not all about getting it all right all the time. In fact, you know, getting it wrong and being supported and encouraged to continue, you know, is a big part of learning. Okay? And the thing about young children is when they're not settled, and I'm just going to get onto some of the issues to do with difficulties in a moment, is that they have limited ability to manipulate their environment. I suppose they do it by their behaviour, by not engaging, by throwing tantrums, I suppose, in an extreme. But, you know, we've got to be aware of that. You know, what's the lighting like? What's the heating like? How tired are they? How tired are we? Is what we're doing relevant for them at the time? You know, we sort of expect them to just do it, but I think we've got to be careful that we've picked the right activity at the right time. Okay, but then again, we should encourage them to continue and be resilient. Because it's that ability to sit and think and do things that eventually is what we all have to do. You know, when you're doing a uni assignment, mum's not there, dad's not there. You know, you've got to be able to, you know, to work your way through it. And a related thing, of course, is persistence. Now, it's interesting, we want our children to be persistent and try hard, but it's a double-edged sword in the sense that they're throwing a tantrum. You think, well, we don't want them to persist on and on with that task, but if they're doing some reading or something, we want them to persist with that. So, but nurturing appropriate, you know, I like the way you're keeping on trying with that word. It's a tricky word, okay? And acknowledging that and reinforcing that. Okay, so we've got the don't list here now. Okay, it's very important. You might come from a very capable household where everybody's things have gone really well, and little Billy comes along and Billy's not coping. Why isn't Billy coping? What's wrong? You know, this is easy. My wife's an emeritus professor. She literally is a brilliant woman, and she can spell almost any word they've invented. Now, I came along, and I've got, you know, some dyslexia. I struggle to read. I struggle to spell. And she still, even though I say, but darling, it's easy for you, but it's not easy for me. And I think you've got to remember that some things come, like our little precocious reader. It was all easy. He was reading before we thought about it. But for a lot of other children who have difficulties, it's important to acknowledge it can be, even if, you know, they're number 3, it can be very hard for them, but it wasn't for their sister and brother. So, you know, you've really got to focus in on the child. If they're having difficulties, you know, don't just say it's easy or you should be able to do it. You need to try hard. You know, you've got to go a bit deeper than that. Now, don't avoid the teacher, even though I've said the way you perceive the child at certain times might be different. But you know, if you're worried and your child's in primary 1, they may not be worried. They may share that worry. but you need to go and talk to them and say, look, he's struggling with this, and they might say, I've seen that too, or they have reasons why that's the case and what you're going to do. And the idea is, this is a bit cultural here again, but don't see spending money on your child as a way of solving their problems. See spending time with your child and sharing, in this case, literacy and that as the important thing. Okay? Now, if the child has a particular issue and problem, yes, it may cost you money, but it's that engagement with them that's going to make the difference. And don't forget the pot plants. Okay, so we're nearly at the end. So this is my pot plants. Here they are. So I've got to get this right now. This isn't a magic trick, so don't get too excited. Okay. So in a sense, this is what we want. We want strong, colourful children who've grown and done well. Okay? This is probably what's typical, average for a typical child. And this is where we start. Now, if you put the seed in here and you put some water in there, you're going to get this. Now, you might think, well, a well-developed, functional child who can read and do things is just what I want. But deep down, you might want one of these. I want my average, typical, normal, happy child to be better than everyone else, bigger than everyone else, smarter than everyone else. But what happens if you want one of these and you put lots and lots of fertilizer on when the seed goes in and you really pump this plant, you'll end up with one of these. Because the seed will die. You will smother it with your attention and your focus and everything else. So just be, careful that you don't overdo the help. In your enthusiasm to have a well-developed child, that you don't overdo it. That you focus on the child and what you're doing and try not to over-fertilise and over-stimulate. Because some children, especially if they've got problems, you can sort of run over the top of them with all the help. So just aim for one of these and avoid this one altogether. Okay, a little bit more just to go along. So don't forget the pot plants. And it is an issue. You can overdo it. So I'm not saying you shouldn't aim high, but just watch what you're doing. Hours and hours and hours of doing stuff to children won't get you there. They'll build up resentment, they'll avoid literacy, and it'll all go wrong. Okay, so what are the barriers? Okay, so if you're worried about your child, firstly is to share that concern. Talk to your partner, talk to your teacher, and get their advice. Talk to other parents. And that's important because it could be that you're just getting a bit uptight about it and there isn't really a problem and their child's fairly similar and that's reassuring enough. But share it because it's a big burden. We come along starting to worry, as I said, and we can carry that worry along. Especially, for instance, if you yourself had problems or you're in other family members, you might think, well, this is inevitable. It may not be at all. Okay. Now, I know that in Singapore, as most countries, children's basic hearing vision is often or nearly always assessed. But if a child is reluctant to engage in social activities, okay, it's really, and their learning looks like it's not good, don't avoid the basics. In my career, I think I've had 3 children I assessed, one at the hospital clinic I worked at and 2 in my own clinic. Where, this is out of thousands, but 3 of them were actually deaf. Now you might think, how can that happen? We had an 11-year-old girl, came to a clinic, paediatrician saw her, I saw her, we walked separately, different time. We came back together and I said, I think she's deaf. And the guy said, paediatrician said, I think so too. We said, no, she was actually deaf. She ended up with 2 hearing aids. And all the time people miss that. Now that's highly exceptional, but the reality is we need to know about these basic sensory sort of, okay? And it's easy to check that and get that out of the way. So and vision does change. Okay, so if it's an issue with language, that's important. That's the basis of it, the way we receive information in terms of learning, that receptive language and memory. And you might think, well, why am I talking about memory when I'm talking about language? A lot of the difficulties when I'm assessing children and collecting data, the parents will say, his memory's terrible. He doesn't remember what we tell him to do. But it turns out it can be a language problem. They have remembered, they can't interpret the language. And obviously expressive language, articulation are important things, and that would lead you to look at getting a review by a speech pathologist. Okay, occupational therapists, they do everything. My wife's an occupational therapist, I have to say that, but the sorts of things that might lead you that way, and May's touched on them. If they're restless, unable to settle, sensory issues, you find you're cutting the labels off their shirts, they're wiggly when they're sitting down, don't just immediately assume they're restless and hyperactive. It could be that they're overly sensitive to heat, pressure, textures, all sorts of things. Okay, if they can't relate to other children in a typical way, that's a concern. If they have difficulty with dressing and eating, or if they can't manipulate things like chopsticks or scissors. OTs do much, much more, I assure you, but they're the sorts of things, some of the things that might lead you to do that. Okay, now I have to give a bit of a plug for the psychologists, of course, but if all of those, not all have been considered, but if you have concern, why is my child learning so slowly? They can hear, they can see, they seem pretty switched on. Well, one of the people you can see is people like myself. I am called a developmental and educational psychologist, but there's also lots of general psychologists, and we can do lots of stuff, but one of the main things that I do in my practice and other people like myself is you measure a person's cognitive capacity. So you do an IQ test, and you can do that from age 3 up to 85 in the tests I've got, but it essentially measures your potential to learn. Now that doesn't mean that restricts you forever and ever. Most people will come out in that normal range. Most people, even at a bigger range, will learn to do early literacy, but understanding that's very important for 2 reasons. One is you might have a child who's very, very bright, but just managing. And parents know how bright their children are. So if you know that child's very bright, well, maybe you've got to look at why are they learning much less than you would expect. A child may be a slower learner and just managing. If you know that, you think, well, the reality is they're doing quite well. I'm not saying you don't have higher goals, but you think, not that they're lazy or not trying, they're doing very well. And let's accept that and get as much as we can out of them. So people like myself look at those things. Now the doctor, the paediatrician, sometimes it's very important not to overlook the sorts of things why you might end up at the doctor's. So the sort of thing is that let's say they can't play with toys very well. And they seem to be a bit odd with that. Instead of playing with toys, they just line them up. Or if they lack imagination in their play. If they're overly, some of these are similar to the OT one, of course, but if they can't settle, they can't direct their attention. If they're tired in the morning. Now, one of the big issues in Australia, and I'm sure here, is that children and adults aren't getting enough quality sleep. And it really is a big issue. And the way I explain it to parents, and sometimes even children, it's a bit like your mobile phone. Every night, more or less, you plug it in, and it gets all charged up and it's ready to go in the morning. If you don't plug it in the next day, it'll probably get to the end of the day or even the next day, but it doesn't work very well. Or it doesn't work, all the time. And that's the same with sleep. We've got to pay a lot of attention to quality sleep of a sufficient length. And as I hinted before, that doesn't start, at bedtime. That starts hours before, winding down, turning off the screens, and if necessary, putting them in the safe. Okay? Having less stimulating things. And screen means TV, phones, iPad. It doesn't mean, okay, they don't have the phone anymore. Screens is screens. Okay? And working the routine, the home routine that I talked about, that's part of the routine. How do we go to bed? Well, we wind down. There's less stimulation. we have a routine of sitting or lying with the child and reading books, maybe having a discussion about the day but not overly stimulating. The lights are lower or turned off, and then we go to sleep. If you have them zapping along with screens and blue light and then expect them to sleep, you know, some people can do that. I can do it. I'm out like that. But lots of people can't, and with young children that means they take much longer to go to sleep, and they get into habits of needing parents with them to sleep, or they take hours and hours and they just sort of fall asleep because of exhaustion. Okay, so they're the sorts of things, as I said, with the tired in the morning, unable to play, unhappy. They're people children that should go taken to their GP and maybe reviewed by a paediatrician. I won't go through that list, but that's just touching on the various things we talked about.